Welcome back, and joining me for a closer look at what's played out on the market scene today is Imtiaz Suliman from Sentio Capital. Thank you so much for your time, Imtiaz. I actually want to start off with the rand because it continues to strengthen. I saw it at some point below 17 rand 30 against the US dollar. Is exposure to the local unit all benefit and less risk at the moment?
Yeah, thanks, Anati. I think what we're seeing happening is that we've seen some dollar weakness come through, which is positive for the rand. And on the back of that, you've also had very strong precious metal prices, so particularly gold and PGMs, which is the platinum group metals, whereby South Africa is a large exporter of those metals, and that bodes well for our terms of trade. So that's very helpful to the rand strength that we've seen. And then we've had interest rate cuts that have come through from a US perspective, and that narrows the interest rate differential between us and the US, with our SARB electing to keep rates on hold. And again, that's another supporter for the rand.
Yeah, I'm also just thinking, Imtiaz, particularly when it comes to the drivers of gold and PGMs at the moment, is it all just the narrative of looser monetary policy? What is it?
Yeah, I think there's multiple factors. It's hard to pinpoint exactly what's driving gold at any one point in time. But if we just look at gold itself, there's a few factors that's in its favor. The one is that you've got interest rates coming down, and in that environment, it's more supportive for gold prices. Secondly, we've had a high level of geopolitical and macroeconomic uncertainty, and gold also tends to do very well in those environments. And then thirdly, you've had the demand from central banks that have been very supportive for gold. So central bank purchases of gold this year are annualizing at 300 tons. And this is roughly double what we've seen pre-COVID, which was running at around 150 tons. So what we see from a gold demand perspective is that central banks are diversifying their holdings, especially out of US treasuries, and recycling that reserves into gold. So gold still makes up a much smaller portion of overall central bank reserves. And there is a view that, if they continue to buy and increase their proportion of gold in their reserve mix, it can be quite supportive for a long time to come.
Well, talking about, drilling into one of the supportive factors, which is interest rates, we have had some speeches coming from Fed officials, and we are waiting for comments from Fed Chair Jerome Powell as well. I think for me, though, what stood out is that a lot of them are quite cautious. So at this point, are more interest rate cuts in question?
If you look at what's being priced in by the market is still looking for 2 more rate cuts out of the US this year. But I think, what will transpire could be quite different. So the cut that we did get from the Fed was, I would call it a hawkish cut, because inflation is still running at 2.9% in the US, which is above that 2% target that the Fed is targeting. But on the flip side, the narrative has shifted to the labor market. And we've seen the US labor market starting to weaken, which is a concern for the Fed. But they also have to keep an eye out on inflation. And if that doesn't come down meaningfully, or if this whole tariff inflation adjustment that we're seeing is not a transitory factor, then they would have to reconsider the part for interest rates, and we might not get the 2 more rate cuts out of the US this year.
All right. Well, not a lot of company news out on the JSE, but let's get into Remgro. It released its year-end results. The company saying that the upward momentum that it saw in the first half of the year filtered through to the second half of the financial year, and more than 80% of its portfolio grew headline earnings, and of course also giving out a special dividend. Just highlight the drivers of that performance.
Yeah, I think if you look at some of the bigger drivers, the likes of a Mediclinic, which makes up around 30% of the earnings and around 25% of the net asset value of Remgro saw a 58% year-on-year uptick in terms of its earnings. There were some one-offs in the last period with regards to write-offs, and that didn't recur. So there was a big turnaround. The other businesses that did perform quite strongly is the likes of Outsurance, and we've seen, a very favorable environment for the short-term insurers in particular, and they've enjoyed strong underwriting margins on the back of that. So that also was up quite nicely. And then another one was Rainbow Chickens, which was also up 200%, and that also contributed quite significantly because you didn't have the recurrence of load shedding and the avian flu issues that the chicken business went through in the last 2 years. So there were some tailwinds that Ramgro benefited from. And from an overall perspective, that special dividend speaks to a strong balance sheet, which is essentially ungeared. They did dispose of their stake in British American Tobacco recently, which again bolstered those cash reserves. And they felt comfortable that you could pay out a special dividend, which was, quite nice to get because this has been a special dividend after a very long time out of Rainbow.
All right. Well, let's get to your stock pick for today, Imtiaz. What are you choosing?
I'm going with MTN. I think we've seen a bit of a pullback in MTN on the back of the Department of Justice investigation into some of MTN's underlying operations. But I think if you look at what's priced in, it looks like those concerns are overblown. I think the supporting factors with regards to the strong growth that we've seen out of Nigeria and Ghana will continue, and they will start contributing towards actual cash returns and earnings growth for MTN going forward. Those markets are very much benefiting from the increased penetration of data and smartphone penetration, which is less saturated than a market like South Africa. So I think those are the two jurisdictions which will support earnings growth. They do have a strong balance sheet as well. So I think the dividend could also be increased from the absolute dividend that MTN currently targets.
All right. Well, thank you so much for your time and for your analysis on what has moved investors' money today, Imtiaz. That was Imtiaz Suliman from Sentio Capital.